Okay, everyone. So today I wanted to take a short break from talking about the anatomy and function of each of the mouth parts and go back to a different part of the head, the antennae. So the antennae are the major sense organ of the head other than the eyes, and in some cases it's more important than the eyes for insects that are in low light or underground, things like that. So the antennae actually have a very simple structure for the most part, but they have very complicated variations. So we'll also go over the variations today because there's not much to talk about with just the plain structure. So the antenna is innervated into the deuterocerebrum, so it's thought to be an evolutionary adaptation of what used to be legs. So when the head metameres coalesce together into the tagma known as the head, the antennae were legs at one point, but they specialized into the antennae, so these sense organs. So you can kind of see the structure of a leg in the antenna. It is still segmented, just like the legs are, and it is still it has its own muscular control. So the major basal part of the antenna is called the scape. So this is, let's say, the surface of the head. The base of the antenna is surrounded by the antennal suture. This is the suture with the head, so it has free motion. And this area here is kind of membranous. And the base of the scape, so this is the scape, is a ball socket. So sometimes when you look at the antenna of an insect, the ball socket is very, very large, and it kind of looks like it's its own segment, but it's not. It's just a ball socket like in your hip or in your shoulder, and then attached to this usually squat, robust segment at the base called the scape. The next segment is called the pedicel, followed by a series of segments called the flagellum. And the flagellum can be kind of any length between, I don't know, in primitive insects, I believe it is 6 segments, but then it goes up to 30 plus segments in some wasps. And in other insects, all this is heavily reduced to maybe just 1 segment or missing entirely. So then you have this chain of segments called the flagellum. So this is the flagellum. And the flagellum is where the majority of the sensory receptors are. This whole thing, if you were to try and identify an insect, all of the segments are called antennomeres. I'm probably going to spell that wrong. Antennomeres. And these are sometimes called the flagellomeres. So just get used to that. So it's the individual units of the antenna, the individual units of the flagellum. How this works is, I've talked about it before, there's this internal skeletal structure made of massive apophyses inside the insect head called the tentorium. And there's heavy musculature attaching the tentorium to the scape, or sometimes the scape to the cranial wall. Let me change this to red. That's what I used last time. So these are muscles going through, anchored to the tentorium. So this kind of acts as a bone for the muscles. And then there's more muscles from the scape to the pedicel. And then each of these has muscles running through it so that they have full muscular control of the antenna, and it can go back and forth, all directions. Additionally, let's use a different color here. Let's use green. The antennae, especially towards the edge, are covered, if you were to look on very high magnification. Sometimes, for some beetles, you don't even need high magnification. They're covered with little holes all over it. And these holes are called the sensilla. Each hole is called a sensilium. And these are pores that are active nerves. These are where the nerves meet the surface, and they act as sensory receptors. Usually it's for smell, but there's all sorts of things sometimes that they can sense. Some species have millions or tens of millions of sensilla all over the antennae, like butterflies frequently use this. This is smell for food. It can also be smell for predators, prey items. It can be, it's heavily used for finding mates. So this would be for pheromones. And they're just all over. Frequently, with beetles and things like that, it'll be at one end, but it's repeated over and over and over again. Let me change colors again. There's a lot of other little structures in here. So one major structure in the pedicel, I'm not going to draw it out, but there's an organ in the pedicel called the Johnston's organ. And this organ allows sensory reception for the placement of all the flagella. So it can detect the movement of the individual flagellomeres. It detects vibration in the individual flagellomeres. And this is used for, one, sense of motion of where the antennae are. But it can also be used for motion of the antennae. It can stabilizes flight in some insects. Stabilize. And then it can also detect EM fields, so electromagnetic fields. Like in bees, they can use this organ to detect electrical currents and things like that. So that's the basic structure of an insect antenna. It's not that complicated, but there's tons and tons and tons of variations on this. So what I want to do is show you some of that, and I do have a lot of examples. Starting with the very generic variations. So these are the most common variations, and there are, I think there's like 12 or 13 different kinds recognized, but there's so many other kind of variations within that. So aerostate it'll be usually two or three large segments topped with a sensillum, or not a sensillum, I'm sorry, a seta. So this is common in flies, or like houseflies and things like that. They have very small antennae. Lamellate is this sort of 3 or more plates stacked together, one in the middle and one on each side. This is common in beetles. Serrate is kind of like a saw, common in beetles. Flabellate are usually in beetles, and it's like lamellate, but much longer, more plates, and it's kind of laterally expanded. Maniliform is something that you see quite a bit in termites and things like that. These are the string of beads. All of the little bead segments are roughly the same size. Plumose is common in like mosquitoes and butterflies and moths, things like that. Cetaceous is, think cockroach antennae. Stylate is usually, again, found in flies. I'll show you pictures of all of these. Geniculate is usually associated with ants, although there are some beetles with it. And then clavate, again, this is kind of the generic insect antenna. Pectinate looks like so plumose means like feathered, so it looks feathered, versus pectinate is kind of like what I've learned is like a fish bone, where you have the backbone and then the ribs coming off it on one side. You can also have bipectinate, where this exists on both sides. Stylate is like a stylus. Cetaceous is like a seta, so like a hair. Clavate is like a club. Maniliform, mono meaning one form. So let me show you some actual pictures of these. And there are variations within each of these. So for example, these are just different variations of kind of the clavate or capitate antenna of butterflies. It's all kind of the same form, but there's a lot of variations between species. Let's start with something easy. So this is a praying mantis, and this would be an example of a filamentous antenna. So you can see, if we zoom in real close here, you can see lots of antennal segmentation. So it's like little cubes stacked on top of each other, and it's very long. Everything's kind of the same size. It's getting a little more narrow, but you can still see it. And then if you look at the base, this picture's not great, but you can see there's like a bulbous swelling. This is that ball socket joint on the scape. The next one would be the pedicel, and then this long antenna is all the flagellum. Let's see. If you want to see something that's also very primitive, this is a filiform antenna. These are walking insects, or not walking insects, walking sticks. Again, you can see that it's, if you if you go to the base here, so you have the ball socket at the base, this is the scape, this is the pedicel, and then you have these rectangular or cylindrical flagellomeres. If you want to go really basic, really primitive, this is an odonate, so a dragonfly. They have cetaceous antennae, so it's just almost like a long hair coming out of their face. So you have the scape, the pedicel, and then the flagellum. More complex antennae, so I don't want to start with that one. That one will be complicated. So like I said with the flies, they frequently have aerostate antennae. So this whole segment here is the base of the antenna. And then these are the flagella, or the seta coming off of the arista. And you can see the base, and then there's a pedicel there. These are very common in the higher order flies. Let's see. With butterflies, butterflies will generally have clubbed antennae, not moths so much, but butterflies usually do. So this is clavate and capitate. This particular one is clavate, so it gets gradually bigger, versus capitate is something like a severe club. So like this little water beetle here has this very thin antenna followed by a severe club. Larvae frequently also have antennae, but they tend to be reduced. So if you look at something like a caterpillar, so these are its eyes. These are called stomata, so you can get your bearings here. Here's the labrum. Actually, that's the clypeus. Here's the labrum. The antenna is right here, and it's 3-segmented. 1, 2, 3. And then it has a seta coming off the end. So very, very reduced compared to the adult. In scarab beetles, they frequently have these plate antennas. So this is called a lamellate antenna. Oh, not sorry. Lamellate antenna. So this is the scape. This is the pedicel. These are the flagellomeres, or the flagellum. This is frequently, the top 3 are frequently just called the club, even though it's a lamellate antenna. And lamellate is distinguished by, generally it's 3, but it's 1 in the middle and 1 on each side, like a fan. Scarabs can also have much more complex fan-like structures called flabellate, which this is what that looks like. So again, you have the scape, the flagellum, and then, the scape, the pedicel, and then this is all the flagellum. And the club here is extremely elaborate set of laterally expanded fan segments. What else? The geniculate antenna, if I can find my good example. I have 2 examples. So this is everyone's favorite friend, an ant. And geniculate means elbowed. So the ant's antenna is pretty much always at a 90-degree angle. And there is one other very common group of insects that have that same thing, and it's a beetle called the curculionids. And they also have a 90-degree antenna. So instead of being straight like most insects, it's bent, almost always at a 90-degree angle, and they tuck this base into their nose here called the rostrum. They have an antennal groove, and on a lot of beetles have antennal grooves. This is called an ironclad beetle, and its antenna is here, and it exists in this groove along the head and the pronotum, and it does that to protect itself from predators and things like that. So it can line this almost maniliform antenna into this groove whenever it needs protection. And then our last 2 are probably the most interesting. This is a pectinate or bipectinate antenna on a moth. So if we zoom in here, it has a base and then a number of arms coming off of it. I think this is bipectinate. It looks like there's a second row in the background. So this is probably bipectinate. And each of these is going to be covered with sensilla to detect pheromones from its mates. And even more elaborate are the antennae of male mosquitoes. This is called plumose. So it's a big feather, basically. And this is covered with sensillae to detect mates. Okay, so again, antennae are not super complicated, but there are a lot of variations. But because of all the variations, they're extremely useful in figuring out what sort of insect you're looking at any given time. Okay, until next time, thanks.